Welcome to tonight, the Dean's Lecture, Engineering and IT at University of Melbourne. My name is Yves Marils. I'm the MC for tonight. I'm also Dean of Engineering. I will start with acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which the event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri people, and pay our respect to their elders, families, past and present. Engineering is one of the old schools in the University of Melbourne, actually the oldest school of engineering in Australia. We started in 1853. And our motto is basically how we service society. And for that, I'm extremely pleased that tonight we're going to hear how engineering and IT can actually service education. And so thank you very much, Catherine Fraser from IBM, to be willing to give us this talk tonight. It's going to be taped tonight. So for people that are shy of asking questions, all questions will also be taped. I just want to let you know that video taping and audio taping will become also available after the lecture, and it will be able to be downloaded from our website. And as I'm the MC tonight, the introduction will be done by Professor Glyn Davis, the Vice Chancellor of the University. Glyn, can I ask you to introduce our speaker tonight?
Evan, thank you. And can I welcome everybody to this series, the Dean's Lecture Series, or Dean's Debate Series on Engineering Information Technology in the Service of Society. And what a wonderful way to begin. Leading the discussion this evening will be our distinguished guest from IBM, Dr. Catherine Fraser, who's a very familiar figure on campus, who has spent much time here, and it's a delight to welcome her back. Engineering and IT Public Lecture Series is a great initiative, and I congratulate the faculty and the Dean on doing so. These are themes that are going to engage this entire nation as we go through change. And as the leading research university in this country, these are themes where we want to make a contribution to the debate, to the argument, to the future. And this series is about doing so. Our academics, our researchers, our students are passionate and keen about advancing knowledge and supporting and creating new industries and reaching out to a wider public. And that's what this series is about. There's so much to cover, and I guess through the series we'll hear about all of the innovative engineering questions that are before us all. The advances in computing that have changed. It's astonishing to read in New Scientist this week that you can take a DNA sample now at a crime scene and recreate the face of the person whose DNA you've just... That's a scary moment. That's when the world has really shifted. Online learning and MOOCs and the whole shift to different forms of education for those of us on campus have been extremely important. I'm delighted that Professor Gregor Kennedy is here tonight, the Director of e-learning at the university. He talks about MOOCs as hothouses and experimental zones where researchers get together and not only talk about data but create whole new analytics about how learning happens, how students absorb information, what works and doesn't work in the classroom and online, of course. And core to us at the University of Melbourne in all of these areas has been our partnership with IBM, which grows out of a shared belief that collaboration can really change the world. One of the expressions, but only just one of the expressions of this collaboration, has been the launch last year of the Australian Disaster Management Platform, which is about national weather patterns and global settings and what we now understand about disaster. It's an understanding of extreme weather patterns and events that allows us to think about future disaster mitigation and management, and that's a partnership we're very proud of. I understand that, just thinking about some of the other areas, I understand that Dean Ivan Marils and Professor Shivkumar Kalaanarama have, at IBM Research Australia, developing some intriguing ideas about electric vehicles, energy storage and mobility. And these are just such important questions for the future that you know this research is going to matter. So it's a great pleasure to see at the start of this wonderful series our Dr. Catherine Fraser. So I'd like to just say a little about her because she has generously agreed to talk about current areas of research and technology, as she did in the 2013 Dean's Lecture, which was a wonderful lecture and gave us a real insight into her view of where technology was taking us. It's great, therefore, to welcome back the Vice President and the Chief Technology Officer of IBM for IBM Public Sector. In this role, Dr. Catherine Fraser works at providing thought leadership for IBM and its customers worldwide on innovation and strategic transformation in fields, an enormous range of fields: government, education, life sciences, healthcare, cities. Catherine is a member of the US National Academy of Engineering. She's a member of the IBM Academy of Technology. Her academic background lies in materials science and engineering, including a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. And in a very timely moment, Catherine will speak tonight on the education revolution, digital, personalised and driving better outcomes. This is a topic of acute importance to every university in the world. Please join me in welcoming the Vice President and Chief Technology Officer for IBM Public Sector, Dr. Catherine Fraser.
That's such a nice introduction. I sort of wonder who it was for, but thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you tonight. There is some trepidation about IBM coming to tell the university about education. It feels a little bit like Coles to Newcastle. But there are some things I think that we've been doing that are interesting, and I think there are some topics that we're all interested in. So I hope we'll have a lively question and answer period at the end. So IBM has a number of reasons to be interested in education. The chart talks about some of them, but if you think about it, IBM, we have a strong corporate citizenship push, and we want to be active as good citizens in education. It's so important to all economies and all societies. We're also a very large employer, and we're very interested in making sure that there's quality and quantity of people being trained in skills that are of interest to us, or our clients, or our business partners. And then finally, of course, we always think that there's a way that technology could help education. And in the past, that's often been in what we might think about as the back office of education: administration, payroll, data centers, high-performance computing, which gets us into the research side. But increasingly, we're seeing more and more opportunity in what you might think of as the front office, the teaching and learning side of education. One of the things you'll see on the chart, I think I have I do, look, is something called the GTO. So every year, IBM goes through a year-long process to try to come up with 5 ideas of new trends that the company ought to be paying attention to. They are always a combination of business trends and technology trends. Whenever possible, we like them to be opportunities for our company rather than things we should be worried about, but there's often a mix. And it starts from hundreds of ideas, and it takes almost a whole year to vet them down to 5. In 2009, one of those 5 was about healthcare, and about the notion that there was beginning to be so much data in healthcare, electronic health records, the digitization of much of what was going on, the adoption of standards so people could actually share data backwards and forwards, that we posited that it would be possible for IT and IT techniques to help with the effectiveness, not just the efficiency, of healthcare delivery. And so we sent our research team off to create algorithms and data processing methodology to see if it was true. And that's gone very well. So in 2013, we said, gosh, what's another industry that is rapidly digitizing, where people are concerned about outcomes and effectiveness, not just efficiency, where you have a very complicated set of stakeholders that are all interested in fundamentally the same issues, the same outcomes. And we said, gee, maybe we could do this for education. When you think about this, there are a number of trends that are driving this. So content is becoming digital. There are some of us who still like to read paper books, but I will say that when I'm on a 15-hour flight, it is much more convenient to have electronic ones. We see everywhere around us the same technologies that affect our lives. I won't ask for a show of hands for how many smart devices you have in your pockets. But they are changing our lives, and they're changing the expectations of our students. Our students are expecting not to have to unplug when they get to school, but that they should be able to interact with the content in school the same way they do in every other time of their lives. And so we're starting to see school districts move towards anywhere learning. Well, it brings a lot of challenges with it. How do you take any content from any publisher, now that it's digital? How do you use any device so the student can bring what they want? And how do you do that in a way that is actually affordable, secure, and privacy protecting? We're seeing enormous data sets be created all over the world. In the US, it's driven by a lot of legislation that says, we now expect you to have good longitudinal data about your students. There are a number of, when I work with city school districts in the States, one of the problems is the lower income kids often move from one part of the city to another. And until these data systems get in place, the children literally disappear and reappear again, and you have no continuity of them across the district. In the US, and I believe it's true in many places, there's more and more pressure, not only in what we would call K-12, primary and secondary education, but at the university level as well, of demonstrating, what am I getting for my education? Demonstrating that we're creating outcomes for students, whether that's employment or further education, not just activity-based. So very like the healthcare example. And then finally, in what we might think of as growth markets or emerging economies, the demand for education is enormous because it has always been the path to success. It has always been a piece of the rising middle class. And so, for example, in India, there are currently 350 universities, but if the projections are correct, by 2020, they would have to have 800 to meet the demand for that education. You see the same kind of trends in Kenya or in Nigeria, where you don't have the infrastructure, let alone the ability to teach that many teachers or build that many schools. And so there's a whole nother forcing function for the notion that technology has to help here. We've got to shift some models in order to get to scale. So obviously what we'd all like to do, right? What would we all like? We would all like to be able to know exactly how to deliver content to each student for what they need to know and the way they want to learn, but we'd like it to be affordable, both financially and in the available time of the teacher and the student. So let's talk about how we might go about that. Some additional data, one of the metrics of we're not crazy when we think about this is that venture capitalists are also looking at it. There's a huge and growing market. And the picture at the upper right is from a trade show in the US last spring called EDUCAUSE, which is sort of an educational technology kind of conference. It was enormous. And almost every booth said that they were doing some form of personalized education. When you ask them more details, it's not entirely clear what they meant, but the words are certainly out there. Just one more set of data. So I'll focus on the second two, for example. So the 21% of students in the US that want to go to university require remediation. They don't actually graduate high school with the level of skill that is needed to enter college. So while it says 21%, the truth is it's worse than that, depending on where you are geographically or what piece of the higher education system you're looking at. At the community college level, where in the US all you need is a high school diploma, and if you live in that community, you can go to that college. Upwards of 50% of those kids need remediation when they get to college, and most of them never get out of the remediation cycle. And so they're incurring debt for higher ed, and they never get a degree. And it is just, I've heard some people talk about it as sort of educational malpractice. And so there's a real burning urge to see if we can't do something about that. A piece of that problem is what you might think about as a mismatch between supply and demand. And the problem's on both ends of the spectrum. So it's very easy for us to say, well, the educational system isn't creating the skills that employers want. Well, let's be honest. Employers are not always really very articulate about what it was they did want. And so we have to work at this thing from both ends. And so while today I'll largely be talking about analytics and data management on the educational side of the page, we're also doing a lot of work on the employer side to get employers to be able to better project what they will need strategically so that the educational system has any shot at responding to it. Otherwise, the timeframes won't match. So I'm going to flip ahead for a minute. So when we did the healthcare work, we started from a premise that said there are different stakeholders with different interests around the healthcare ecosystem. Same is true in education. But that fundamentally, what everybody wants is they want kids to stay in school. They want kids to graduate from school. They want kids to perform well in school, to get a good, high-quality education, and they'd like them to get a job at the end, right? And so while their lenses coming in are different, fundamentally everybody wants those same things, whether we're the student or the parent or the instructor or the administrator. And so from that premise then, you say, all right, so there's a common core of data and analytics that can serve all the constituencies. And that's the way in which we're going about this. So we see a number of ways in which, if I switch now to higher ed, I'll go backwards and forwards, I apologize. But if I switch now to higher ed, we see a number of ways in which this thought about big data can really affect higher ed. Some of them are perhaps obvious. We talk a lot about personalized learning. We talk a lot about how do you identify the student at risk. But also, how do you communicate with your students in an engaging manner, right? How do you deliver the content? How do you identify the patterns and the needs ahead of time? How does a student actually experience the university? Because that experience starts long before he actually arrives on campus and hopefully extends far after he's successfully graduated. And so it starts from recruitment, acceptance, enrollment, the educational experience, which is becoming more diverse all the time between on campus and off campus and online, and there are probably others I haven't put up there. We all hope that he matriculates and gets a job and loved the university so much that he's a loyal alumni who will contribute back in a number of ways later on. And if he really loved it, he'll send his kids, right? Which is why I closed the circle. Across all of that, there's a notion of brand and reputation. How does the child become aware of the university? How does he even know that that's a website he wanted to look at? How do you portray the brand so that people can find sort of where they belong? And how does social networking play into all of this before they get to campus, after they're on campus, after they've left? So let's look at some examples of what other universities are doing. You know, the problem with doing a presentation is you never remember what your next slide was. We're going to look in 3 different buckets here. We're going to look at some examples around reputation and recruitment, and also some examples around retention. So, Seton Hall University is a sort of medium-sized university in the state of New Jersey, and they wanted to see if there was a way that social media could help them in how they did their recruiting, how they reached students, and more importantly, how they got the right students to say yes. And so we did some work with them, and it really was on both ends of that. It was, how do you use social media to get your brand out? Because that's where these kids are looking. They're not necessarily going to go do a Google search to find you. They'll find you on other media. After you've gotten their interest, how can you use social media to help the students start to feel like they belong, like they're a member of a community and a network, even before they arrive on campus? And for Seton Hall, it's been very successful. You can see both the increases in enrollment, which means of the kids I admitted, which ones of them actually said yes, as well as in putting down a deposit. Because the ugly truth is that there are some kids who say yes to more than one university, and you don't really know who they're going to until they put some tuition down. The second example is Wichita State. Wichita State is not as premier a school as Seton Hall, but I'll tell a funny story in a second. And they wanted to do 2 things. They wanted to better manage their marketing dollars when they were recruiting students. They wanted to have a better notion of predicting who was really likely to come, but they also wanted to work on retaining them, keeping them in college after they enroll. Now, this recruiting thing is non-trivial. It's actually a very complicated optimization problem mathematically, because you want to attract kids who will do well at your institution so that they will stay, so that they will graduate, so that you can close that circle. But you also want to have objectives around how you balance your finances. Scholarship students versus ones who pay full freight. You want to have inclusion objectives. You want to have a diverse student body, whether that's gender or ethnicity or geography. And so it becomes quite a complicated optimization. So, and the funny story to this is, I'm sure it's not true. I am sure it's not true. However, we'll just make the observation, and we won't draw causality from it, that Wichita State has not been in the big basketball competition in March of every year in the US in over a decade. And I'm not saying, but somehow now they're doing all this analytics on how they recruit, and they made it in this year. So. We're not taking credit for it. I'm not. But they did see a 15% boost in registration, not unlike the results we saw from Seton Hall. They saw that they could get 96% accurate on predicting which were the kids that would want to come if they admitted them. Now, it's a little bit like overbooking the airline, right? You always make more admissions than you think are actually going to come. But very great accuracy. And then the other thing that they saw is that on this registrations point, it's not just initial registration. They saw an improvement across the 4 years or 5 years of the students in the university, because they could do a better job of matching kids to classes in which they were likely to do well. And they adjusted the timing of some classes because they knew more about the actual behavior of their students. So they had less dropouts. I'm going to switch gears for a second and give an example from primary secondary. Hamilton County in Tennessee is a very challenged county. It has a few prosperous areas and a lot of inner city, not very prosperous areas. They were struggling with a very high dropout rate and very poor performance on the state tests, standardized testing. And just to give you a flavor, at the most troubled of these schools, they realized that they couldn't call home to ask the parents to help, because in many cases the phone lines had been disconnected because the family couldn't pay their phone bills. So just to give you a sense of what they were up against. And so what they did was, this is like the first baby step, and it already shows so much value. So then we'll talk about what might we do after that. So what they did was they used the data that they had about the students, both primarily administrative and a little bit of academic, to identify the students who were most at risk. They did not create new interventions. They did not personalize the interventions. But what they did was to make sure that everyone in the ecosystem around these kids knew which kids needed more support. And by doing so, they raised their graduation rate by 8 points. Now, 80% is still not a great number, but they raised it from 72. So they went from almost a quarter of their kids not graduating to 80%, and a 25% in the annual dropout rate. And so cumulatively, that graduation rate will improve. I'm going to skip the Alabama one, which is a more decision-making administrative one. I'll talk for a second about a project at Purdue. So not an IBM project, but shows what can be done similarly in higher ed. So at Purdue, what they did was to take a bunch of data about how students were interacting with the online content. Were they really reading everything? Were they going to the tutor centers? How did their homework look? And they did kind of a stoplight, red, yellow, green. Compared to previous students, is this student on a good path for this course or not? They did not do it in all classes. They did it in what they called watershed classes. The introductory math class, the introductory biology class. The classes that if you do badly in that class, it seldom ends well for the rest of your academic career. And what they did then was that they made that stoplight available to the faculty, and they enabled the faculty to send what looked like personal emails to the students. They were in fact one of 4 emails. You're doing well, keep up the good work. You're doing well, but you're actually not, you're not doing all the reading, and you really need to pick it up or you're going to start slipping. You're slipping, maybe you'd like to go to the tutorial center, or you should be very worried and get your butt in gear. Right? And so one of those 4 emails would be sent from the professor's email to the student based on the color code. Now what's interesting about this, so 2 things. One is, and I'll show you the results in a second. One is there was no real personalization. There was no new intervention. They were just being directed to the resources that already existed. And the reason for doing it that way was to not have it look like additional burden to the faculty and to see if they could move the needle by such a technique. But the other interesting thing is that both the faculty and the students that were involved in this really liked it. And even the good students got better. And so they went and did some interviews. And essentially the message back was, it was great to know that anybody noticed. And that came as much from the good students as from the ones who were struggling. And so whereas at primary, secondary, we're very focused on how do we support the teachers, at university, we expect the students to take more responsibility for their own education, but you still have to get them to care, right? So, oh, that's interesting. I had like lines on that table on my computer. But the way that you read this, I'll do it quickly. So they didn't do all the classes. So there were about 1,600 students who were in at least one class that was instrumented in this way, and about 5,000 who were not. So in this first section, what you see is the retention rate. The inverse of this would be the dropout rate, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 year. And you see that the ones in the instrumented classes, the retention rate is much better and is sustainably better across the years. The graduation rate is similarly higher. This last column is to indicate that you might say, oh, well, that must be because somehow it was the smarter kids who were in the classes that were instrumented. But that last column is the SAT. It's our standardized test that everybody has to take to get into college. And what it indicates is that actually this lower line, with better retention rates, better graduation rates, were in fact the kids who coming in looked to be less capable than the kids across the top line. So this is without adding any personalization, no new intervention, no really one-on-one anything. So think about how much more we can do when we get to personal. I'm going to skip that because there's a cartoon of some lady, I don't know who she is. So just as in the healthcare example, we sent the research team out to see whether what we had posited in the GTO was really doable. Used very similar techniques to the analytics and the case management we've been doing in healthcare, and in fact it is doable. It starts from a notion of being data-centric, right? So you'll notice I've got all these charts with circles in the middle that have data in them. And we believe that that's really critical. That today, a lot of what happens is, particularly at the primary, secondary level, the school systems are wasting time having to move their data or their content when they change some application. They changed the grade book, or they changed the student information system or something, right? So if you start from a data-centric perspective with industry standard interfaces, now you can actually start talking about any content, any device, plug your apps in and out as you like them. It not only gives much more flexibility to the school system, but it's just, it saves us from wasting the time of moving data and content around. So at the core of this is the Student Information Hub. We're doing a lot of work on content analytics themselves. It's an area in which IBM has been doing work for a number of years, and I'll show you an example of that in a scenario. Being able to do detailed analysis on the content is what in many ways now allows us to talk about personalized learning pathways. Because one piece of it is analyzing the content to understand what this child really does or does not know. And the next is to know, well, what else might we give him that would help him based on learning style and other things. Learning management system is important, and the career pathways thought is at this moment aspirational, but we're really hoping that if we can get the employer side of that previous chart to marry up to the education side, not just as a, here's the list of things I'd like, please make them for me, but as a real partnership where the employers mentor students across the pathway, that it's really possible. We're doing that as an experiment in some schools in the US right now. It's also the way that Germany does its internship programs. So BMW, for example, will have people, more kids come and do apprenticeships or internships at their factories than they will hire, because they view it as their contribution to train skills that might get hired by their competitors anyway, that it's part of their social give back. So let's talk about how such a scenario might work. And this is based on work that we're actually piloting right now with the Gwinnett County schools outside of Atlanta. It's a very large school district. Again, it's got some prosperous suburban schools and some very not prosperous city schools. Superintendent of that district has been on a journey to what he calls learning anywhere. He said, he's the one that says, I don't want my kids to unplug when they come to school. So he started by getting the background data under control, the administrative stuff, then moved on towards digital content and tablets, which now enables us to do some of this higher level work. It also means that we're doing our work with real teachers, real data, real use case, and real teachers to tell us whether what we're doing does or does not fit in their available time and the way they like to do their jobs. So we don't end up with some IT thing that sits on a shelf because the teachers all hate it. Okay, so what happens? So, oh, I didn't know that was a build. So the eighth grade math teacher comes in and says, show me something about my class. And the system shows her a risk profile. And she asks for some more, and it says that in this group at risk, you've got quite a number of them that are English as a second language. You've got some special ed. Free meals is a measure of economic. And then here are the rest of the students that are in that risk profile. She did not ask for those 4 buckets. The system said, as I look across the risk students, here are the common characteristics of them. She also gets a Pareto of the students at risk, and she decides that she'd like to go look at John Diaz down here. So what does she learn about John Diaz? She gets a detailed, this is now based on his homework, his tests, in-class assignments, anything that's digitally available about John. And so what you see is that there are actually some concepts in geometry that he does just fine on. And there's a bunch of others where he's kind of in the mix with everybody else. And then there are a couple that he just doesn't get at all. And so every time he's got to do congruence based on transformations, you could almost imagine this child's eyes glazing over, right? So she says, okay, so what could I do about that? And the system comes back with recommendations on content for her to consider. And the content is scored not only for applicability to transformations, and it's, we're talking a couple of paragraphs here. We're not talking somewhere in this chapter I found that keyword, right? But the content is also scored for readability. Maybe John's problem is English. Maybe it's really not a math problem. So are there ways of teaching this that are different than what I've shown him before, that are more visual, where the text is less dense, right? And so she gets a bunch of recommendations scored in that way. This is, again, that deep content analytics at work. And she can decide what she wants to give him as an intervention plan, a little extra stuff on his tablet. Now notice that this does 3 things. It keeps the teacher completely in charge of what does or doesn't go to the student. The second is she's not slowing the rest of the class down going over concepts that maybe John's the only one that didn't understand. And nobody else in the class needs to know that John got extra material because it's on his tablet. So he's not embarrassed, the class isn't slowed down, and the teacher's in charge. She can then go in later and see whether it made any difference, and the sad truth is it didn't. But she also sees some more information about him, that his attendance is really dropping. And so she goes and adds to her intervention plan. She asks him to come in and see her at lunchtime, because she wants to see, okay, look, if I sit across the desk from him, can I get the light bulb to go on this one topic? You know, what else can I do? And she also sets up to meet with his parents, because a child who's not in class has a hard time learning. Now, and we're doing this with teachers so that we know that what I just showed you fits into the dashboard and the kind of case management that they're doing in the class every day. Because it's really important for them to be able to say to us, great concept, I wouldn't use it, because we want it to really be adopted. Now, the other thing I wanted to just point out is that this content analytics thing is not trivial. So on the upper left, you have the kind of way that a standard is written. Here are the things that the student should be able to do. Interpret expressions that represent a quantity in terms of its context. On the right, you have the way that content comes in from a publisher. Not exactly the same vocabulary, not the same focus, not the same organization. And so what these content analytics are doing is not only mining this for concepts and readability and that kind of stuff, but is mapping it to the standards, so that we enable the teachers now to be able to deliver different content to different students, but all of it is aligned to the standards that they're expected to deliver. Right? Personalized education in an affordable way. So let's shift gears for a second. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to go back. I can do it from here. One of the things I didn't talk about when I had my big circle up was we call this IBM Watson Foundations for Education, because I'm going to talk about the real Watson in a second here. And we're calling it that because if you think about Watson, the system that plays Jeopardy, right, it does all kinds of fancy things that I have not described. But it is grounded on a notion that you have your data under control, that you have these foundational pieces that we're talking about. So with that, now I'm going to flip ahead. I am. And talk about the real Watson. So the real Watson is the game that played Jeopardy, the machine that played Jeopardy. And we've been using it, we've been working with it over the last almost 2 years now, to train it to help doctors, nurses, and others in health examples. By taking deep text mining, it can read more than any of the rest of us can, making connections and inferences across that corpus of information to support decision-making at diagnosis, treatment, and payment. But the question now is, okay, so what could we do in education? And I'm going to start actually with the one in the middle. Watson Discovery is something that we are already doing with a medical school in the US. So, and it's true, I think you'll see the analogy to the rest of education really quickly. So in medical school, we're doing this with Cleveland Clinic. Often people learn things they learn facts in a particular class about a particular category, right? But when a patient is in front of you, they're not one category, they're a whole person. And so to get from classroom to diagnosis, you have to be able to figure out how to connect those dots. Now, Watson, so an education example would be, if you asked a small child, what floats in water, an iron nail or a balloon? Well, the child would say a balloon, because that's what he's seen. Well, Watson's never seen anything. And so Watson would also say a balloon, but Watson gets there by Archimedes' principle, buoyancy, density, surface tension. And by turning that kind of inside out and showing the child, well, here's how Watson got to the answer, the system is starting to model how to draw inferences, how to bring disparate pieces of information together. And that's what we've been doing with this medical school, to start modeling the way of how do you connect these dots, how do you make inferences across this broad corpus of knowledge that you've picked up one class at a time. Now, we also think there are two other things that we could do. Obviously, you could use Watson as sort of an online tutor. The way that we've been doing that is very focused on not giving the child the answer, but on giving the child the concepts that he needs to get to the answer himself. Right? Similarly, we think that Watson could help guide teachers to content. I've been spending some time with some young people who volunteered for a program we have called Teach for America, which is new college graduates who go and spend a couple of years in very troubled school districts. And they said that one of the things that took the most of their time was searching through the internet, trying to find additional content, either for the child who was struggling or for the child who was really exceptional and they didn't want the child to turn off in class. So I think Watson could play a role there as well. And then there are a couple of other ideas about, are you smarter than Watson? Are you smarter than a fourth grader? Or, can you find where Watson went wrong as he was working his way through a problem? But all on a notion of, on the one hand, supporting teachers and students, and on the other hand, making content more engaging, using the system that way. So to summarize, I think all of these pieces come together on a notion that says we've got all this data, all of us do, in all of our institutions, and we could be doing much more with it to serve our teachers, our professors, our administrators, I have to nod to the front row, and most importantly, the students who are at the heart of this. That we do think it's possible to get to personalized education in a way that scales. We think that mobility, that using one-to-one devices intentionally, rather than a true story in my high school, the kids walk into class, they put their cell phones in a box, and they go and they sit and they learn in a traditional classroom, and they can pick their phones up again when they leave the room. Instead of using the technology to actually make the educational experience more compelling. We think that there is a real opportunity to do something about supply and demand, to connect what employers need to what school systems are producing, particularly because all the studies say that we are long past the point where any of us will graduate and only need what we knew when we graduated in the rest of our working lives, right? We all know that to be true now. It's going to be only more true. There's a study, I think, by the OECD that said that 80% of the 10-year-olds today will go into jobs that do not exist now. Right? So this notion of how do we support lifelong learning, whether it's formal or informal, is with us to stay. And then I didn't talk at all about sort of the support and administrative side, but we believe that there's a real interplay here. Everything from getting that background stuff under control so you can afford to invest in the things in the teaching and learning side, to things like if you decided you were going to change how you delivered education, do you have the right buildings? Do you have the right classrooms inside the buildings? If you went to a flipped classroom and you were doing your lectures as a MOOC, and what you wanted to do in person was problem solving and team building and all those skills that we know we actually need when we get to the marketplace, what are you going to do with your campus? Whether that's a high school or a university. So there is more stuff in that number 5 as well. But they come together, I think, with a notion that says, sometimes we view IT as either an inconvenience, or if I'm a teacher, it looks like something that's looking over my shoulder. I think it really can be, part of the answer. And maybe when we look at places like India or Kenya, it needs to be a big piece of the answer. So with that, I would be delighted to have some questions.
Thank you very much, Catherine,
you're
for
welcome.
a very interesting talk and challenging teachers.
My name is Hugh Kingsley. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I think the era and the pedagogy you're talking about is excellent, but what concerns me is the control of the data. For example, I no longer feel that I have control of my laptop computer. Whenever I'm doing something, there's always something telling me it's going to stop, restart, install, God knows it. And then you're finding out, how the data's being sold everywhere and anywhere. So what concerns me is, what controls are going to be taken over from these individuals in this era?
So I think one of the things that you highlight is the importance that we need to think about this as a system, and we need to think about things like security and privacy as the first item, not as an afterthought. There are a couple of really famous examples in the US where school districts thought, well, all I really need is a tablet. So I'll buy tablets from the tablet guy, and I'll buy content from a publisher, and, well, I know a little bit about IT, I'll do the rest of this myself. And what happened was that the kids hacked through the security on day 2, and it has not ended well. So I think we're all concerned about how do we put sufficient protections in place. A lot of it is going to come down to really solid authentication. Who has a right to see what data? And then where are you going to keep it? And so this is one of those cases where we think cloud computing is really important because, it not only does it take the cost down, but it actually makes it easier to integrate data. But it may be a place where it's got to be a hybrid, right? Where you've got some things that are out in public, but a great deal of it is still behind the firewall. But at the core, I think the first thing is that the institution has to really decide what its policies will be. We have the technology to put it into the code. If the institution's clear on what do they want it to be protected as, right? How tightly do they want to lock it down? How do they want to authorize people to get access to it? So I absolutely understand your concern. I think partly by working from a system up instead of a tablet in, that we have a better chance.
I'm paying for this stuff. I buy the computer, I buy the software. It controls me. It'll turn off and start when it wants to. And it takes my data when it wants to. Those are the things that I concern me greatly, and particularly for children.
Well, and so I'm not going to comment on whoever's operating system is doing that to you.
Thank you for that. Gregory.
Thanks for a great talk. I really appreciate it. I would like to get a comment on you from how teachers cope with the data. One of the things that we're thinking about is the way in which we can provide analytics to teachers and how they make decisions using the data that we provide them, and some of the challenges maybe that you've had in terms of digital literacy and the way in which teachers can make meaning out of data that you provide from the system.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great challenge. I would say a couple things. I think certainly the work that we're doing in Gwinnett County says that it's not impossible. So I'll start there. I think it's really important that we do this work mindful of what looks like value to the teacher. I think certainly in the US there's a lot of fear that they're going to get measured rather than helped the more things become IT enabled. And so the first is, what looks like value to teacher. And that comes in a couple of ways. What questions did she really want answered, right? And then the second is, how does the answer need to show up so that she can actually use it? And some of that is use of visualization, as you saw, rather than tables and stuff. Some of it is having them actually pilot it and tell you what fits in their workflow. We found the same thing in healthcare. The world is littered with health IT that no doctor wants to use, right? So how do you do it in a way that doesn't take time they don't think they have, doesn't take them away from the class, right? In the doctor example, how do you do it in a way that he doesn't have to turn his back on the patient, right? Same issues. But I think it's why doing pilots in the real world are so important. Yes, sir.
Hi, Tony Allen, Trinity College. Where do you think we'll be in higher education in 5 years' time?
Well, that's a somewhat open-ended question. If I were that prescient, I would probably be in a different business. But a couple things I think are probably easy. I think that this notion of a merging of some stuff online, some stuff in class is going to be everywhere. We're going to wonder why we ever asked the question. However, really getting right how best to use which technique, I think, could take us a couple years yet. I work with a business school in France, and I say it that way because it's much better with the accent. The head of this business school says, a MOOC is just a book. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they're much more than that. So I think that one's easy. I think the second one is I think that we will have a different demographic in our universities in 5 years than we do now. It may not be every institution, because some of this comes back to kind of this branding thing of which institution wants to be for which kind of student. But in aggregate, you know, the preponderance of university students is not going to be 18 to 24. There's going to be a lot more older students, and I think that that will affect how we teach and how we deliver content. Because if university today is a mixture of coming of age and learning some skills, hopefully the adult learners have done the coming of age thing, right? But they may not have done, they may have gone through college at a time where all you needed to know was your discipline. And they actually need some of the broadening that our young students bring with them, right? So I think those are two things. Simon, please.
I mean, it's a really good question, and it's something we are trying to understand from both the IBM perspective and the impact of this technology. But let's just frame this with something that Catherine started with at the beginning. It's very difficult for us to envisage this in the context of the mature markets. But let's look at this in the context of places like India and Brazil and China, which cannot develop the infrastructure fast enough to deliver the traditional modes of education. And one of the sort of movers in terms of higher education amongst the mature markets is to build offshore campuses. And we're shifting away from that. And in fact, we're seeing a retraction in that. And how do we now produce what we're calling the edgeless university, or the seamless university, where, you know, we actually have students all over the world? And I think it's a big challenge for universities how they're addressing the issues that are going to arise from that. And let's just look at two or three of them. One in particular. If we're going to move from an institution of 30, 40, 50,000 students, which is fundamentally a campus-focused institution, what are the impacts of shifting towards an online institution? And of course, we've got the technology issues around how we deliver online learning, but let's look at all of the other downstream effects. So through the 90s, with the expansion of higher education, you had the issues of how are we dealing with a whole new demographic of students coming into higher education that don't have the background, don't have the kind of autonomous sort of learning capabilities that traditionally students have had. So they need a lot more support, a lot more help, and we've developed all of those sort of back office capabilities that have delivered that. But fundamentally, we've said we can't grow that. It's not cost effective. So we've put the emphasis on the lecturer and said, well, lecturers, you must also be mentors. You understand the university regulations. You understand all of the issues around progression and what you do if you failed a course or you didn't submit your assignment. So you take on all these mentorships of your students and you pick those up. And a big move in the UK, for example, with the expansion of higher education, was the shift of the burden onto the teaching staff to also be, you know, support staff, because they had the direct contact. How do you deal with that when you've now got 150,000 students all taking their courses online? So this is the sort of thing that Watson is beginning to address, because you have a technology that actually understands real language and can actually mine all of your digital content around all of your regulations, all of your procedures, and become almost a virtual online mentor. So these are the challenges we have to face. But and I think the higher education system is looking at this saying, well, we've got MOOCs, we've got online learning, but what are the downstream implications for the traditional way in which we've delivered higher education? What's the implications for my campus? How is the campus relevant in the future? How is the context of learning relevant? What do I want the campus for? And the whole notion of flipped classrooms and Catherine touched on this, and again, we're looking at solutions. How do you rebuild the campus whilst the whole thing is still functioning as a fundamentally industrial model of lecture spaces and seminar rooms, when you want to shift towards more kind of learning hubs where you may have people sitting in the same room doing different courses, but they're sitting around small sort of hubs of learning activity and collaborative activity. How do you restructure your campus whilst at the same time all of your learning and teaching is built around 300, 400-seater lecture theatres and seminar breakout rooms? How can you do it without building lots of buildings and replacing the existing infrastructure? These are the challenges higher education is facing, because the traditional model, whilst it might continue to operate in the US, the UK, Western Europe, Australia, won't work in those developing nations. Brazil exports most of its students. The private education sector in Brazil actually serves more of the Brazilian higher education market than the public sector. So how are you going to deal with that in India and China and so on, where the traditional model of delivering that infrastructure won't work? So the university of the future, as you've rightly talked about, in 5 years, will look like a very different place if it's going to accommodate that demand from those students.
You can see there's no lack of passion across all of IBM. We'll get you a mic, 1 second. Yes.
Mike Smith. I'm actually visiting from the University of Calgary in Canada, and I'm a professor there. 1/3 of my merit pay each year is associated with my teaching. What are you doing in this business to help the dean to make sure that he gives me enough money for all the effort that I'm putting into my teaching? So although you say people are worried about evaluation, how are you using it to evaluate the quality of your teachers and the efforts that you're putting in? And how are you training the teachers to actually be able to use this, and at the same time they're supposed to do research and service?
So the first thing I'll say is I would never get between you and your dean. But it's interesting because I spent the last 2 days in San Jose at a conference of many universities across the US and some from Ireland and Scotland and other places, talking about some of these issues and how do we train the next generation of teachers, and at the university level, what are we doing with our graduate students, because they'll be the next generation of faculty. And so the focus in that conference was not about, the role of IT in education, at least not directly, but it was about this trend that we all see of wanting what we might call T-shaped people. People who have deep expertise, but also have the ability to learn from many sources, to talk to people from disciplines other than their own, to communicate well, those skills that make a difference when they're out in the workplace. And so we had a very similar conversation about, we say the words, are we shifting how we measure and reward in order to actually develop students that are like that and to support teachers who are moving in that direction? And I would tell you that it was one of those sobering, look at yourself in the mirror kind of conversations, because it's a challenge. So I don't know that there is a role for this kind of technology in answering the question you posed to me, except that these same systems can give administrators a much better insight into what is and isn't working on the campus. Not so much interrogating what a single professor is doing, but understanding, for example, do I have a real problem with all my first-generation students? Do I have a problem with my adult learners, or in the US we have a lot of returning servicemen who are now trying to go back to college and have brought enormous emotional issues back with them from the wars. So it does start to give administrators a way of probing differently what's going on across their department or across their campus in support of their goals. I think, this nice man had his hand up before.
I will take the last question. I may just have one comment on this, because I actually did that with my professors of electrical engineering not so long ago. And I did indicate to them that Watson knew more electrical engineering than any one of them. And I'm one of those, okay? So I was included. But what Watson can't do is actually solve a problem that nobody has ever solved before. So the innovation part is still the part of the domain of human brain. So your job is not yet in danger.
Can I get a letter to my team about it?
Yes, sir.
Thanks very much. My name is John Kushnachuk. I'm from the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. I have one question and two suggestions, if that's all right.
Okay, yes.
The first question has to do with Watson, the Watson Foundations for Education. Who's doing the research on the deep data and content analytics that you use?
So
if you could just give me a name, someone I can look up.
So what I would actually tell you to do is to call Glenn Whitewick, who is our research lab director here, and have him route you through. It's largely people in our India research lab, but they're starting, this is not a sales pitch, but they're starting with Content Advisor, Content Navigator, a bunch of commercial products that IBM already has, and then they're building on top of that taxonomies and some of this higher level work.
Yeah, I'd like to see that sort of stuff.
Oh, sure, that'd be great. And you had suggestions for me.
Now, two suggestions. One is with respect to the dilemmas or the tasks or the challenges we face, trying to anticipate what higher education is going to look like in 5 years, the technical possibility of, one super university is with us. So we have to go back, I think, to your premise at the beginning, which was we all want the same thing, high quality education and a job. I don't think that is as unproblematic as you might think if you don't need any universities in India, because they can all study out of Melbourne University, online. The challenge, though, is in terms of this, social acceptance of an online qualification.
Well, I think there's a bunch of issues. I think there's issues about certification. And so, for example, in the State University of New York, the president, Barbara Zimfer, has said that she'll make all the courses available online. Yeah. So you could go to, one of the lower tiered schools in the SUNY system and take online the classes that are offered at the highest tier of the SUNY system. Well, that sounds wonderful, except for two things. One is, what does that say about the brand of the top flight one who wants to charge more tuition than this one? And the second is, who now decides what patchwork of courses, even across one university system, let alone, I've come in with 3 badges from MOOCs, and I took this class over here, and I took that class over here. Who's going to start deciding what does it take to credential a degree? Well, right. So there are non-trivial problems out there.
Start to get schizophrenic, exactly. My second suggestion: Watson isn't the best name for your online mentor. Mr. Watson, God bless him, he belongs to the 20th century, and I think his values belong to the 19th century. I was going to suggest Hal, but that didn't turn out well. So
you know why he's named Watson?
Yes. Well, I can guess. You're IBM, right?
We are IBM.
Yes, well, I can guess. That was it.
One more question at the back, and then we stop at the lady.
Thank you very much. I was interested in the relationship between home and school, and particularly at primary and secondary level, and how you're seeing parents, their relationship with the school changing from the parents' perspective, and how their participation changes and what that looks like in this environment. Thank you.
So for that one, I'll tell a personal story. So I have 4 sons. 2 of them are college age or beyond, and 2 of them are still at home. When my older kids went through school, I had the parental experience of when the report card came home, or sometimes if I actually got to see a test paper, then we would have the discussion about what the heck was going wrong. Right? My 2 younger ones, the grade book is online. And so I had a conversation just last week with my 17-year-old and said, did you know that your music theory teacher thinks you've only handed in 2 of the homework assignments due this month? So as a parent, I am much more engaged because I have these systems. Whether my kids like it or not is an entirely different discussion. But I am much more engaged, and I actually feel like I have something I can talk to the teachers about because I'm more informed. And so I send much more email to the teachers than I used to do. You know, so my son was in a show at the school, and his math teacher had given them homework on Monday that was enormous, and it was due by 10 p.m. on Tuesday. And I knew that he was going to be in rehearsals from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. both of those nights. And I also know my kid. And so when I said to him, ask your math teacher for an extension, I knew that he would not. So I did. And she was happy to do it. So the long story, but the short version is, that's my experience. And my experience in these pilots that we're doing is the same. That it's giving parents a way to engage besides, you know, baking cookies or going to the art show. And that I think that's a good thing.
I think we're going to leave it here. Now we can talk for much more and a lot of interesting conversations going to. But just let us thank again, Catherine, for a very interesting